78-year-old Frank Martinez lay bleeding on the shoulder of Highway 287, his frail body covered in bruises and cuts from the brutal beating he had endured after 3 men had robbed him of his Social Security check and left him for dead on the isolated Texas road. The retired carpenter had been walking home from the bank when the attackers struck, taking not just his money, but nearly taking his life, leaving him too weak to call for help and too far from civilization for anyone to hear him. "Please, somebody help me," Frank whispered into the empty desert air, his voice barely audible as blood trickled from a head wound that had been bleeding for over an hour. That's when salvation arrived in the form of 18 motorcycles. The Lone Star Guardians MC were returning from a memorial ride for fallen veterans when club president Jake Steele Wilson spotted what looked like a bundle of clothes beside the highway. These battle-hardened protectors were about to discover that sometimes the most important rescues happen when you stop to investigate something that doesn't look quite right. What the mainstream media would later report as a Good Samaritan incident was actually the beginning of a family bond that would transform both an elderly man's final years and a motorcycle club's understanding of what it truly means to serve and protect. Would you like to join us for this incredible journey? Subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss what happens next. The Lone Star Guardians Motorcycle Club had been riding the highways of Texas for over 12 years, their membership consisting entirely of military veterans who had found brotherhood and purpose through their commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. What had started as weekend rides among former soldiers had evolved into one of the most respected emergency response organizations in the Southwest. Jake Steele Wilson, the 49-year-old former Marine Corps Force Recon commander who led the Lone Star Guardians, was concluding their monthly memorial ride to honor fallen veterans when his combat-trained instincts detected something that made every alarm in his protective system activate. The dark shape beside Highway 287 looked wrong, too still to be debris, too large to be roadkill, positioned in a way that suggested human presence. "All units, possible emergency situation," Steele commanded through his helmet radio to the 17 riders behind him. "Unidentified object on highway shoulder that may require investigation. Could be civilian in distress." The response was immediate and coordinated. 18 motorcycles began slowing and positioning themselves for potential emergency response, their riders' military training automatically engaging protocols for unknown situations that might involve civilian casualties. Sergeant Major Rick "Doc" Patterson, a former Army Special Forces medic who served as the Guardian's medical coordinator, was first to confirm Steele's suspicions through his military-grade optics. "Steele, that's not debris," he radioed with urgency that came from 2 decades of combat medicine. "We have a human casualty, elderly male, obvious injuries, appears to be unconscious or semi-conscious." Through his binoculars, Doc could see Frank Martinez lying motionless beside the asphalt, his clothing torn and bloodied, his position suggesting that he had either fallen or been placed there after sustaining serious injuries. The isolation of the location meant that conventional emergency services might be hours away. "Jesus Christ," whispered Captain Mike Hawk Thompson, a former Air Force pararescue specialist whose experience with civilian emergency response allowed him to recognize the severity of what they were witnessing. "How long has he been out there? In this heat, without medical attention, he could die before help arrives." Steele felt his Marine Corps training engage as he processed the tactical assessment combined with the humanitarian crisis they had discovered. An elderly man with serious injuries lying alone on a desert highway represented exactly the kind of situation that required immediate military-style emergency response. "All units, standard medical emergency protocol," Steele ordered, his Force Recon training automatically shifting him into command mode. "Doc, immediate medical assessment and stabilization. Hawk, emergency services coordination. Everyone else, traffic control and area security." If you're enjoying the story, write from which city you are listening to in the comments. The 18 Lone Star Guardians members who responded to Frank Martinez's crisis represented some of the most advanced emergency medical and tactical training available to American forces. Former Special Forces medics, Navy corpsmen, Air Force pararescue specialists, and Marine Corps reconnaissance experts, all united by their commitment to protecting innocent life, regardless of circumstances or personal risk. Doc Patterson dismounted his Harley and approached Frank with the careful precision that 23 years of combat medicine had taught him. What he found was worse than their initial assessment had suggested. This wasn't an accident or a fall, but clear evidence of violent assault that had left an elderly man to die alone. Steele, this is a criminal assault, Doc reported through encrypted communications as he began his medical evaluation. Multiple contusions consistent with beating, possible internal injuries, severe dehydration, and psychological trauma. He's been out here for hours, maybe since last night. The medical assessment revealed the full horror of what Frank had endured. Bruises covering his torso and arms indicated systematic beating with fists and possibly weapons. A head wound suggested he had been struck with something heavy. Later investigation would reveal it was a tire iron. The positioning of his injuries and the evidence around the scene painted a picture of 3 attackers who had robbed and brutalized an elderly man before leaving him to die in the Texas heat. Doc's examination revealed additional details that made Frank's survival even more miraculous. His wallet had been taken, but the attackers had also stolen his walking stick, his prescription medications, and even his shoes, leaving him completely defenseless and unable to seek help effectively. The cruelty was systematic and deliberate. "Sir, can you hear me?" Doc asked gently as he began emergency medical stabilization, using the calm voice that had comforted wounded soldiers in combat zones around the world. "You're safe now. We're here to help you." Frank's eyes fluttered open, revealing confusion, pain, and a kind of desperate gratitude that came from someone who had given up hope of survival. Who are you?" he whispered, through lips cracked from dehydration and exposure. "We're veterans, sir," Doc replied with quiet pride, as he established an IV line to combat Frank's severe dehydration. "We heard you needed help." The emergency medical response that followed demonstrated why the Lone Star Guardians had become legendary among Texas emergency services. Doc's combat medical training allowed him to stabilize Frank's condition using battlefield techniques adapted for civilian emergencies, while other Guardians established a protective perimeter and coordinated with approaching ambulance services. Master Sergeant Carlos "Tank" Rodriguez, a former Marine Corps engineer, had positioned his motorcycle to block traffic while establishing an improvised medical station using supplies that all Guardians carried for emergency situations. His military logistics training proved invaluable for creating a safe zone where medical treatment could continue without interference. "Medical station established," Tank reported as he finished setting up windscreens and medical supply organization that would allow Doc to work effectively. "Area is secure, traffic is controlled, and we have clear access for incoming ambulance services. If you've watched this far, say in the comments, what secret do you keep?" Staff Sergeant Tony "Scout" Rodriguez, a former Army Ranger whose reconnaissance skills made him invaluable for complex operations, had been conducting a systematic examination of the crime scene while the medical emergency was being managed. What he discovered confirmed everyone's worst fears about the nature of Frank's injuries. "Steele, this was definitely a robbery assault," Scout reported through tactical communications. "I found Frank's wallet discarded over there, empty except for his ID. Multiple tire tracks suggest 3 separate vehicles stopped here. Blood evidence indicates the assault occurred right here, and there are drag marks suggesting they moved him after the beating." Scout's crime scene analysis revealed additional disturbing details. The attackers had taken time to search Frank thoroughly, indicating this wasn't a crime of opportunity, but a calculated assault on someone they knew would be carrying cash from his Social Security visit to the bank. Cigarette butts near the scene suggested the attackers had spent considerable time planning or celebrating their crime. The positioning of Frank's body near the road shoulder indicated that the attackers had deliberately placed him where he would be visible to passing traffic, suggesting either that they wanted him found eventually or that they didn't care whether he lived or died after serving their purposes. Hawk Thompson's coordination with emergency medical services had resulted in a helicopter ambulance being dispatched from Lubbock, reducing Frank's transport time to a trauma center from hours to minutes. His Air Force experience with medical evacuation procedures proved invaluable for ensuring that Frank received appropriate care as quickly as possible. "Medical evacuation ETA 8 minutes, Hawk announced as the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors became audible in the distance. "Trauma team is being prepped at University Medical Center and will be ready for immediate surgery if necessary." Corporal James Phoenix Martinez, a former Navy corpsman whose medical training complemented Doc's Special Forces expertise, had been monitoring Frank's vital signs and psychological condition throughout the stabilization process. His assessment revealed both the severity of Frank's physical trauma and the psychological impact of being attacked and abandoned. Patient is responding well to fluid replacement therapy, but he's showing signs of severe psychological trauma consistent with violent crime victimization, Phoenix reported to Doc. He keeps asking if the attackers are coming back, and he flinches whenever anyone moves quickly near him. The psychological assessment was crucial for understanding that Frank's recovery would require more than medical treatment. He would need specialized care for crime victims and the kind of protective environment that could help him process the trauma of being beaten and left for dead. The helicopter landing required precise coordination to ensure that the medical team could access Frank safely while maintaining the crime scene integrity that would be crucial for prosecuting his attackers. The Guardians established a landing zone while continuing to provide emergency medical support and psychological comfort. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the flight nurse who accompanied the medical team, was impressed by the quality of emergency care that Frank had received from the motorcycle club. Whoever provided initial treatment probably saved his life, she reported to Doc as they prepared Frank for transport. The IV fluids, wound stabilization, and psychological support were exactly what he needed. Military medical training, Doc replied simply. We've seen this kind of trauma before, and we know that survival often depends on more than just medical intervention. It requires people who refuse to give up on wounded warriors, whether they're soldiers or civilians. If you're enjoying the story, write from which city you are listening to in the comments. The helicopter transport to University Medical Center represented Frank's transition from the brink of death to comprehensive medical care, but it also marked the beginning of his relationship with people who understood protection, loyalty, and the commitment that some individuals make to serving others regardless of personal cost or convenience. Sergeant First Class Mike Ranger Davis, a former Army Ranger whose tactical training had been crucial for securing the scene, had been documenting everything for the criminal investigation that would inevitably follow. His military intelligence background allowed him to recognize evidence that civilian observers might miss. Tire impressions suggest the attackers were driving older vehicles, probably 1990s pickup trucks, Ranger reported to Scout as they completed their scene analysis. The systematic nature of the assault and the evidence of planning suggest these weren't random criminals. They targeted Frank specifically, probably because they knew his routine. The investigation would later confirm Ranger's assessment. The attackers had been watching Frank for weeks, learning his schedule for banking visits and identifying the isolated stretch of highway where they could assault him without witnesses. Their crime was premeditated, calculated and designed to eliminate the possibility of victim testimony. Staff Sergeant Danny Medic Thompson, a former Air Force pararescue specialist whose medical training had supported Doc's emergency treatment, had been maintaining communication with the trauma center to ensure that Frank's medical team would be prepared for his specific injuries and condition. Trauma team is briefed on patient condition, age and mechanism of injury, Medic reported as the helicopter departed. They're prepared for possible internal bleeding, head trauma, and the kind of complications that elderly patients can develop after prolonged exposure and dehydration. The medical coordination was crucial because Frank's age and the nature of his injuries created complex treatment challenges that required specialized expertise in geriatric trauma care. The Guardians' military medical background had allowed them to provide information that would prove invaluable for his hospital treatment. The criminal investigation that began immediately after Frank's medical evacuation revealed the scope of the violence he had endured and the criminal enterprise that had targeted him. Detective Lieutenant Maria Gonzalez of the County Sheriff's Department coordinated with the Guardians to preserve evidence and gather intelligence about the assault. The evidence you preserved and the scene security you maintained were crucial for our investigation, Detective Gonzalez explained to Steele during a briefing at the hospital where Frank was receiving treatment. Without your intervention, both the victim and the evidence would have been lost to weather, traffic, and time. The investigation revealed that Frank had been targeted by a criminal gang that specialized in robbing elderly victims in rural areas, choosing isolated locations where their crimes were unlikely to be witnessed or interrupted. Frank had been their 7th victim in 6 months, but he was the first to survive their attacks. These criminals count on elderly victims being alone and helpless, explained FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, whose unit specialized in violent crimes against senior citizens. They study their targets, learn their routines, and choose locations where they can commit violence without interference. The Guardian's intervention not only saved Frank Martinez's life, it gave us our first witness who could identify his attackers. If you've watched this far, say in the comments, what secret do you keep? The FBI investigation revealed disturbing details about the criminal organization that had attacked Frank. Led by Bobby Ramirez, a 32-year-old career criminal with a history of violence, the gang had been operating throughout the region by targeting Social Security recipients on their monthly banking days. Their method was simple but effective. Identify elderly victims who lived alone, follow them from banks to isolated locations, rob them of their cash and medications, and eliminate witnesses through violence. Frank was their seventh target, but unlike their previous victims, he had survived long enough to be rescued and to provide testimony that would prove crucial for prosecution. The gang's previous victims had been found days or weeks after their attacks, usually dead from exposure or injuries, making criminal investigation nearly impossible. Agent Walsh's behavioral analysis revealed that the gang was escalating their violence levels with each attack, suggesting that they were becoming more comfortable with killing and were likely planning even more serious crimes. Frank's rescue had interrupted a criminal trajectory that was leading toward serial killing. Without the Guardian's intervention, we believe this gang would have continued escalating their violence until they were committing outright murders for relatively small amounts of money, Agent Walsh explained during a briefing with local law enforcement agencies. Frank's survival and testimony gave us the break we needed to stop them before they killed more people. The evidence collected at the scene and the intelligence gathered from Frank's testimony led to search warrants for properties throughout the region. The coordinated raids that followed resulted in the arrest of 7 individuals involved in the criminal enterprise, including 3 who had directly participated in Frank's assault. Frank's medical condition gradually stabilized over the following week, but his recovery would require more than physical healing. The trauma of being beaten and left for death had created psychological wounds that would need specialized care and the kind of support that only people who understood trauma could provide. The Guardians maintained a protective presence at the hospital throughout Frank's recovery, with different members visiting daily to ensure his safety and provide the companionship that elderly patients often lacked during extended medical treatment. Their presence also served as a deterrent against any attempt by the criminal gang to eliminate the witness who could testify against them. Dr. Patricia Chen, the geriatrician who supervised Frank's medical care, was amazed by the improvement in his condition that correlated with the Guardian's regular visits. Frank's healing has accelerated significantly since these men began visiting him, she observed during a medical team meeting. Their presence provides psychological support that our medical interventions can't duplicate. The improvement wasn't just psychological. Frank's physical recovery was progressing faster than medical projections had predicted. His appetite had returned, his sleep patterns had normalized, and his cooperation with physical therapy had improved dramatically since he understood that people cared about his welfare and were committed to his protection. "Why are you helping me?" Frank asked Steele during one of their conversations in the hospital room. "You don't even know me, and I don't have anything to offer you in return." "Sir, protecting our community includes protecting you," Steele replied, with the quiet dignity that military service had taught him. "You're part of our family now, and family takes care of family. If you're enjoying the story, write from which city you're listening to in the comments." The promise was sincere and would prove to be life-changing for both Frank and the Guardians, creating a relationship that would transform the final chapter of an elderly man's life while teaching a group of warriors about the deepest meaning of service and protection. The hospital social worker, Rebecca Martinez, had initially been concerned about the motorcycle club's involvement with an elderly trauma patient, but Frank's response to their presence had convinced her that this was exactly the kind of support he needed for successful recovery. "Frank lights up when the Guardians visit," Rebecca observed during Frank's discharge planning meeting. "He's gone from being withdrawn and fearful to being engaged and hopeful." These men have provided therapeutic benefits that traditional counseling couldn't achieve. The transformation was visible to every member of Frank's medical team. Nurses reported that he was more cooperative with treatment, more willing to eat, and more optimistic about his recovery when he knew the Guardians would be visiting. His blood pressure and heart rate improved measurably during their visits. Frank's physical therapy sessions with Maria Rodriguez, a former Army physical therapist who worked at the hospital, had become opportunities for him to share stories about his life, while learning about the military experiences that had shaped his new protective family. Frank tells me about his 40 years as a carpenter, building homes for families throughout Texas, Maria reported during one of their planning meetings. He understands construction, craftsmanship, and the satisfaction that comes from building things that protect people. He and the Guardians have more in common than they initially realized. The connection between Frank's civilian construction experience and the Guardians' military engineering and building skills created natural bonds that went beyond their rescue relationship. Frank's knowledge of home construction and maintenance would prove valuable for the community service projects that the Guardians were already planning. As Frank's hospital stay extended into his second week, the depth of his isolation before the attack became apparent to the Guardians who spent time with him. He had no family visitors, no friends checking on his progress, and no social connections that extended beyond the medical staff caring for him. Frank's been alone for 3 years since his wife died, Steele reported to the other Guardians during one of their planning meetings. No children, no siblings still living, no close friends from work. He was completely isolated when these criminals attacked him, and he would be going back to complete isolation if we don't maintain our relationship with him. The realization that Frank's vulnerability had been created by social isolation rather than just age or physical frailty influenced the Guardians' understanding of their protective mission. They began to recognize that preventing future crimes required addressing the root causes that made elderly people targets for predators. 4 months after being found beaten and dying on Highway 287, Frank Martinez had transformed from a lonely, isolated elderly man into the beloved patriarch of an extended family that included 18 of the most protective people he had ever encountered. The Lone Star Guardians had not only saved his life, they had given him a reason to live and a family that valued his wisdom while ensuring his safety and dignity. Steele Wilson sat in Frank's living room, reviewing the latest home security reports, while the sound of motorcycles arriving for their weekly family gathering echoed from the driveway. The modest house had been transformed with state-of-the-art security systems, wheelchair accessibility modifications, and the kind of protective infrastructure that ensured Frank would never again be vulnerable to the predators who had nearly killed him. The medical alert system is working perfectly, Steele reported to Frank as he studied the latest monitoring data. 24-hour coverage, direct connection to emergency services, and immediate notification to 6 different Guardians if anything unusual happens. Frank smiled as he watched Guardian members setting up tables for their weekly dinner, many of them veterans who had become the sons he had never had, and the family that had been missing from his life since his wife's death 3 years earlier. I still can't believe how much my life has changed since you found me on that road. The relationship between Frank and the Guardians had evolved far beyond the dramatic rescue that had brought them together. The elderly man had become the heart of their organization's family structure, providing the kind of civilian wisdom and unconditional love that helped veterans process their transition from military to peacetime life. "Tell me about the home renovation program," Frank requested, noting the detailed construction plans spread across Steele's briefcase related to the community service initiative that had been established in his honor. "We are now providing free accessibility modifications for elderly veterans throughout Texas," Steele explained enthusiastically. "Wheelchair ramps, bathroom safety equipment, emergency communication systems, and security upgrades for veterans who are aging in place but lack the resources to maintain safe housing." The Frank Martinez Home Safety Program represented something unprecedented in veteran community service. Combat soldiers using their construction skills and financial resources to ensure that elderly military personnel could live independently and safely in their own homes rather than being forced into institutional care. The program had grown from Frank's personal experience with vulnerability to become a comprehensive approach to elder protection that addressed both immediate safety concerns and long-term independence issues. The Guardians had discovered that many elderly veterans were living in conditions that made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of predatory behavior that had targeted Frank. If you're enjoying the story, write from which city you are listening to in the comments. Dr. Patricia Chen, a geriatrician who had been treating Frank since his rescue, was amazed by the improvement in his physical and psychological condition that had resulted from his integration into the Guardians family. "Frank's recovery has exceeded every medical prediction we made," she reported during a presentation to the Texas Geriatrics Association. "His transformation demonstrates the powerful impact that strong social support can have on elderly trauma recovery." The secret to Frank's remarkable healing wasn't just the medical care he had received, it was the Guardians' understanding that elderly trauma victims needed more than physical treatment to recover from violent crimes. They needed protection, companionship, purpose, and the knowledge that people cared about their welfare. Dr. Chen's research had documented measurable improvements in Frank's cognitive function, physical strength, cardiovascular health, and psychological well-being that correlated directly with his integration into the Guardians' family structure. His medical outcomes were significantly better than statistical predictions for elderly trauma survivors. Frank's case challenges conventional assumptions about aging and recovery, Dr. Chen explained to medical colleagues studying geriatric trauma care. When elderly patients have strong social support and protective relationships, their healing capacity exceeds what medical science predicts based on age alone. Doc Patterson had become Frank's personal medical coordinator, using his Special Forces medical training to monitor Frank's health, while also serving as his advocate with healthcare providers who sometimes underestimated elderly patients' potential for recovery. "Frank's not just a patient, he's family," Doc explained to medical students who came to study geriatric trauma recovery. "When you treat elderly people like they're valuable, important family members instead of medical problems, their healing accelerates in ways that traditional medicine doesn't predict." Doc's approach to Frank's continuing care combined military medical expertise with family advocacy, ensuring that Frank received appropriate medical attention while also maintaining his dignity and independence. The relationship had evolved beyond caregiver-patient to something deeper and more protective. The weekly medical assessments that Doc conducted in Frank's home had become opportunities for the elderly man to share stories about his life, while Doc monitored his physical and psychological condition. These informal sessions provided health care that was more personalized and effective than traditional medical appointments. "Frank tells me about his 40 years building houses, and I tell him about my 20 years patching up soldiers," Doc reflected during one of his progress reports to the Guardians. "We understand each other because we both know what it means to use your skills to protect people and build things that last." If you've watched this far, say in the comments, what secret do you keep? Frank's role in the Guardians community had expanded beyond being a beloved family member to becoming their advisor on civilian matters, community relations, and the kind of wisdom that only comes from 7 decades of life experience. His insights had proven invaluable for helping veterans navigate challenges that military training didn't address. Frank understands things about civilian life, family relationships, and community building that we never learned in the military, observed Hawk Thompson during one of their regular planning meetings. "He's taught us that protecting people doesn't just mean rescuing them from immediate danger, it means helping them build lives where they feel safe, valued, and connected." Frank's advice had influenced major decisions about Guardian community service programs, membership requirements, family support initiatives, and the organization's long-term strategic direction. His civilian perspective balanced their military training with practical wisdom about how communities functioned. The integration of Frank's insights into Guardian operations had improved their effectiveness in civilian settings, helping them develop programs that addressed community needs rather than just military-style emergency response. His influence had made them better community protectors and more effective advocates for vulnerable populations. Captain Derek "Tank" Williams had applied his Army engineering training to developing Frank's home security system, but the project had expanded to become a comprehensive elder protection program that served vulnerable senior citizens throughout their region. Tank's military experience with force protection had proven invaluable for identifying and countering the threats that elderly people faced. "We designed Frank's security system to address the specific vulnerabilities that criminals exploit when targeting elderly victims," Tank explained during a presentation to the National Association of Chiefs of Police. "Isolation, limited mobility, predictable routines, and lack of immediate emergency response capability. The security program included electronic monitoring systems that could detect intrusions or medical emergencies, emergency communication devices that connected directly to Guardian response teams, regular check-in protocols that ensured daily contact with protective family members, and rapid response capabilities that guaranteed help would arrive within minutes of any alert. Tank's approach combined military security principles with elder care expertise, creating sustainable protection networks that could operate effectively without ongoing government funding or bureaucratic oversight. The success of Frank's protection had inspired similar systems for over 200 elderly residents throughout Texas. The home security installations had become community events where Guardian members worked together to upgrade elderly residents' homes while building relationships that provided ongoing social support. These projects combined practical protection with family building that addressed both safety and isolation. When we install security systems, we're not just protecting houses, we're building relationships that make elderly people part of our extended family, Tank explained to volunteers who wanted to replicate their model. The technology is important, but the human connections are what really keep people safe. Scout Rodriguez had channeled his Army intelligence expertise into investigating the criminal network that had attacked Frank, working closely with law enforcement agencies to identify and apprehend the gang members who had been targeting elderly victims throughout the region. Frank's case gave us our first surviving witness and our first intact crime scene, Scout explained to FBI investigators during the Joint Task Force briefing. His testimony and the evidence we preserved led to the arrest of 7 individuals involved in a criminal enterprise that had been operating for over 2 years. If you're enjoying the story, write from which city you are listening to in the comments. The investigation had revealed a sophisticated criminal operation that had targeted elderly victims based on Social Security payment schedules, choosing rural locations where crimes were unlikely to be witnessed, and using violence levels that were intended to eliminate witnesses rather than simply rob victims. Scout's intelligence analysis had identified patterns in the gang's behavior that allowed law enforcement to predict their activities and prevent additional attacks. His military training in threat assessment and pattern recognition had proven invaluable for understanding how the criminals selected and approached their targets. The criminal network had been responsible for 17 attacks on elderly victims over 2 years, with Frank being the only survivor until the Guardian intervention disrupted their operations. The systematic nature of their crimes and their escalating violence levels suggested they were progressing towards serial killing. Frank's survival and his willingness to testify had been crucial for dismantling the criminal network and ensuring that the gang members received sentences that reflected the severity of their crimes against vulnerable elderly victims. Frank's courage in facing his attackers in court helped us get convictions that will prevent these criminals from hurting other elderly people, reported District Attorney Jennifer Walsh during the sentencing hearing. His testimony was detailed, credible, and powerful enough to convince the jury that these men represented a clear and ongoing threat to senior citizens throughout the region. The trial had been difficult for Frank, requiring him to relive the trauma of his attack while facing the men who had beaten him and left him for dead. But the Guardian's presence throughout the legal proceedings had provided the emotional support he needed to complete his testimony. The convictions had resulted in prison sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years for the gang members, with the ringleader Bobby Ramirez receiving the maximum sentence under Texas laws for crimes against elderly victims. The sentences ensured that the criminals would not be able to target other elderly people for decades. Staff Sergeant Mike Phoenix Martinez had developed a community education program that taught elderly residents how to recognize and avoid the kind of predatory behavior that had targeted Frank. His military training in threat assessment had proven valuable for helping senior citizens understand criminal patterns and protective strategies. Criminals who target elderly victims look for specific vulnerabilities: isolation, predictable routines, limited mobility, and lack of communication with protective family or friends, Phoenix explained during community safety seminars at senior centers throughout the region. Our program teaches elderly residents how to reduce these risk factors while maintaining their independence. The education program included practical training in situational awareness techniques, adapted for elderly capabilities, emergency communication procedures that connected directly to Guardian response networks, self-defense strategies that worked within physical limitations, and coordination with protective networks that could provide rapid response when needed. Frank had become the program's primary spokesperson, using his survival story to teach other elderly residents about the realities of criminal targeting, while also demonstrating that recovery and continued independence were possible even after experiencing severe trauma. If you've watched this far, say in the comments, what secret do you keep? Frank's willingness to share his story has been crucial for getting other elderly residents to take protective measures seriously, Phoenix observed during one of his program evaluations. When he tells people about the importance of staying connected and staying alert, they listen because they know he's survived what they're afraid of. The education seminars had reached over 3,000 elderly residents throughout Texas, with documented improvements in safety awareness and protective behavior among participants. The program's effectiveness was measured by reduced victimization rates in communities where it had been implemented. Frank's presentations combined practical safety advice with inspirational testimony about recovery and resilience, helping elderly audiences understand that accepting protective measures didn't mean giving up independence, but rather ensuring that independence could continue safely. Corporal James Ranger Davis had established a transportation program that ensured elderly residents throughout their community could access banking, medical care, grocery shopping, and other essential services without the kind of isolation and vulnerability that had made Frank a target for criminals. Elderly people become targets when they're forced to travel alone to isolated locations carrying cash or prescription medications, Ranger explained to community organizations interested in replicating their elder protection model. Our transportation program ensures that senior citizens are never alone and vulnerable during activities that criminals use for targeting. The transportation network included scheduled group trips to banks on Social Security payment days, medical appointments with Guardian escorts for elderly patients who lacked family support, grocery shopping expeditions that combined safety with social interaction, and emergency transportation for urgent medical needs or safety concerns. Guardian members volunteered their time and vehicles to ensure that elderly residents could maintain independence without accepting dangerous levels of isolation. The program operated 7 days a week with on-call capabilities for emergency situations. Frank had become one of the program's most enthusiastic participants, not just as someone who benefited from safe transportation, but as someone who helped other elderly residents feel comfortable accepting protective services that some viewed as admissions of vulnerability. Frank helps other seniors understand that accepting help isn't giving up independence, it's being smart about staying safe, Ranger reported during his program updates. He's living proof that you can accept protection and still live on your own terms. The transportation program had served over 800 elderly residents during its first year of operation, with 0 incidents of crime or victimization among participants. The success had attracted attention from government agencies and non-profit organizations interested in replicating the model. Master Sergeant Carlos Tank Rodriguez had expanded his home security expertise to develop a comprehensive elder abuse prevention program that identified and addressed various forms of victimization that targeted elderly populations beyond just street crime. Elder abuse takes many forms: financial exploitation, physical violence, neglect, psychological abuse, and medical fraud, Tank explained during a presentation to the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services. Our program addresses all these threats through community education, protective services, and coordination with law enforcement. If you're enjoying the story, write from which city you are listening to in the comments. The Elder Abuse Prevention Program included financial literacy training that helped elderly residents recognize and avoid scams, family mediation services that addressed conflicts between elderly parents and adult children, legal advocacy for elderly victims of exploitation, and emergency shelter services for elderly people escaping abusive situations. Frank's case had taught the Guardians that street crime was only one of many threats that elderly people faced, and that comprehensive protection required addressing all forms of victimization that targeted vulnerable seniors. The program had identified and prevented 43 cases of elder abuse during its first 18 months of operation, including financial scams, family exploitation, medical fraud, and neglect in care facilities. The success had influenced state legislation, strengthening penalties for crimes against elderly victims. Staff Sergeant Danny "Medic" Thompson had established a mobile medical clinic that provided healthcare services specifically designed for elderly residents who had difficulty accessing traditional medical care due to transportation, financial, or mobility limitations. Many elderly people avoid medical care because of barriers that have nothing to do with their health conditions, Medic explained to medical students studying geriatric care accessibility. Our mobile clinic brings healthcare to elderly patients while also providing the social support and advocacy they need for optimal health outcomes. The mobile clinic operated from a converted recreational vehicle equipped with basic medical equipment, examination facilities, and communication systems that connected to hospital networks for consultation and referral services. Medic's military medical training allowed him to provide comprehensive primary care while identifying conditions that required specialist treatment. Frank had been one of the clinic's first patients and had become a volunteer who helped other elderly residents feel comfortable accessing medical care from the unusual but effective service. His endorsement had been crucial for gaining trust from elderly patients who were initially skeptical of medical care provided by motorcycle club members. Frank shows other elderly patients that we're professional medical providers who happen to ride motorcycles, Medic observed during one of his progress reports. His confidence in our services helps overcome stereotypes and fears that might prevent people from getting the health care they need. The mobile clinic had provided medical services to over 600 elderly patients during its first year, with documented improvements in health outcomes and patient satisfaction compared to traditional medical settings. The success had attracted support from medical professionals and healthcare organizations throughout Texas. If you've watched this far, say in the comments, what secret do you keep? The annual Frank Martinez Day celebration had become one of the largest community events in their region, bringing together thousands of people whose lives had been touched by either Frank's story or the Guardian's broader community protection services. The event commemorated not just his rescue from Highway 287, but the ongoing work that had grown from that life-saving intervention. 4 months ago, 3 criminals left me for dead on a lonely highway. Frank addressed the enormous crowd during the anniversary celebration. Today, the family that saved my life has created protection and community for thousands of elderly people throughout Texas. The celebration included success story presentations from elderly residents who had been protected from various threats, families who had benefited from the home safety programs, veterans who had found purpose through service, and community members who had become volunteers in various protective services. 81-year-old Dorothy Martinez took the microphone to share her experience. 2 weeks ago, criminals tried to rob me outside the pharmacy using the same tactics they used on Frank. The protection program that grew out of his rescue meant that I wasn't alone. I had immediate help from people who knew how to handle dangerous situations. Dorothy's successful protection from attempted robbery embodied everything that Frank and the Guardians were working to achieve through their community-based elder safety programs. Her experience demonstrated that the lessons learned from Frank's victimization were being applied effectively to prevent similar crimes. 76-year-old Robert Chen shared his story of being saved from financial fraud. Scammers were trying to steal my house through fake mortgage papers, but Frank's financial protection program taught me to recognize the warning signs. The Guardians helped me report the crime and get legal protection. The community that had formed around Frank's rescue represented something unprecedented in geriatric care, a sustainable collaboration between elderly residents, military veterans, law enforcement agencies, and community organizations that had created measurable improvements in safety, health, and quality of life for vulnerable populations. Local bank manager Patricia Rodriguez spoke about the practical impact of their elder protection efforts during the anniversary celebration. Before Frank's programs, we had elderly customers being targeted for robbery at least once a month, she testified. We haven't had a single incident in 4 months because criminals know that elderly people in this community are protected. The economic and social revitalization of their rural community demonstrated the connection between safety and prosperity. Property values had increased because elderly residents felt secure aging in place. New senior-friendly businesses had opened to serve a growing population, and crime rates had dropped dramatically as protection programs created environments where predators couldn't operate effectively. If you're enjoying the story, write from which city you are listening to in the comments. 1 year after being found bleeding on Highway 287, Frank Martinez had been appointed to the Texas Commission on Elder Safety, where his programs and philosophy were being implemented throughout the state. The retired carpenter, who had once been left for dead, was now advising government agencies on community-based solutions to problems that had plagued elderly populations for generations. The commission appointment represented official recognition of Frank's expertise and the effectiveness of the community-centered approach to elder protection that had grown from his rescue. But for Frank personally, it represented an opportunity to ensure that other elderly people would never have to experience the terror and isolation he had endured. Frank's survival and recovery have demonstrated that elderly trauma victims can not only heal from violent crimes, but can become powerful advocates for protecting other vulnerable seniors, commented Dr. Robert Williams, the Commission's chair. His programs show how military veterans and elderly civilians can work together to create communities where aging Americans can maintain dignity, independence, and security. Frank's first recommendation to the Commission was the establishment of state funding for community-based elder protection programs that combined veteran volunteer services with professional social services. His proposal was based on documented results from the Guardian programs rather than theoretical approaches to elder care. The Commission's unanimous approval of Frank's recommendations led to the creation of the Texas Elder Protection Initiative, a state-funded program that provided grants for veteran organizations to develop community protection services for elderly residents. The initiative was the first of its kind in the United States. The Guardian's community protection model had been adopted by veteran organizations in 15 states, creating a network of volunteer emergency responders who understood that true protection meant building strong communities rather than simply reacting to crimes after they occurred. Frank's role on the Commission required him to spend significant time in government meetings and policy discussions, but he insisted on maintaining direct contact with elderly community members through regular visits to senior centers, community meetings, and individual homes where he could share his story and encourage others to accept protective services. "I can't advocate for programs I haven't personally benefited from," Frank explained to fellow Commission members. "Policymakers need to understand not just what works in theory, but what actually saves lives and changes communities in practice." His dual role as policy advisor and program participant created unique insights that influenced statewide initiatives. Frank's recommendations were based on lived experience with both victimization and protection, rather than academic theories or bureaucratic considerations. The Commission's annual report highlighted Frank's work as the most effective elder protection program in Texas, noting that communities served by Guardian-affiliated programs showed 80% lower rates of crimes against elderly residents and 90% higher rates of successful aging in place. If you've watched this far, say in the comments, what secret do you keep? 2 years after 18 motorcycles had stopped to investigate what looked like debris beside Highway 287, the ripple effects of Frank's rescue continued to spread throughout the Southwest and beyond. The Guardian's model of veteran elder community protection had been implemented in over 60 cities, creating a network of programs that had helped thousands of senior citizens avoid becoming victims while maintaining their independence. The expansion had been carefully managed to ensure that core values and operational excellence weren't compromised by rapid growth. New chapters were required to complete extensive training programs, demonstrate commitment to both veteran and elder welfare, and maintain the professional standards that had made the Guardians effective partners for law enforcement agencies and social service organizations. Each new chapter was mentored by experienced Guardian members who provided training in emergency response, community protection, elder advocacy, and the relationship-building skills that made their programs sustainable. The quality control had resulted in consistent success across different geographic and demographic areas. The Guardians had grown to over 300 active members across 8 states, with chapters providing emergency response, community protection, educational support, and family assistance services. Their annual budget, funded entirely through donations and volunteer labor, exceeded that of many government elder services agencies while achieving better outcomes at lower costs. The organization's financial transparency and effectiveness had attracted support from major foundations, government agencies, and individual donors who wanted to support programs that achieved measurable results. The Guardian's success had influenced funding priorities for elder care programs throughout the United States. Frank's influence extended beyond direct service delivery to fundamental changes in how communities understood the relationship between elderly vulnerability and veteran purpose. His programs demonstrated that sustainable protection required addressing both individual safety and collective responsibility, both personal security and community well-being. Frank taught us that every elderly person saved from victimization and every veteran saved from purposelessness has the potential to save others, Steele reflected during his transition ceremony as he prepared to hand leadership to the next generation. The man we found dying on that highway has saved thousands of others through the programs his recovery inspired. The transition ceremony brought together over 7,000 people whose lives had been touched by either Frank's direct intervention or the broader network of protection that had grown from his rescue. The event included testimonials from elderly adults who had avoided becoming victims, veterans who had found purpose through service, and community members who had discovered the power of intergenerational cooperation. Frank, now 79 years old and serving as the Guardian's Director of Elder Relations, had been chosen to deliver the keynote address at Steele's retirement ceremony. His transformation from dying victim to community leader represented the kind of growth that effective protection could inspire. "Steele and the Guardians saved my life on Highway 287, Frank said during the ceremony, "but they did more than save me from dying. They gave me reasons to live, family to love, and work that matters. Now it's my responsibility to make sure we continue saving lives and building family for anyone who needs protection and belonging." If you're enjoying the story, write from which city you are listening to in the comments. 5 years after his rescue, Dr. Frank Martinez, he had been awarded an honorary doctorate in community service from Texas State University, was serving as a consultant for the National Highway Safety Administration, helping develop protocols for identifying and assisting elderly victims of roadside crimes throughout the United States. The lesson I learned that day wasn't just that good people exist when you need help, Frank told audiences at the National Conference on Elder Safety. The lesson was that everyone has the capacity to become someone else's lifeline, someone else's family, someone else's reason to believe that protection and love are real. Frank's presentation at the National Conference included statistical analysis of 5 years of Guardian programs, over 12,000 elderly residents protected from various forms of victimization, 8,000 veterans engaged in meaningful community service, 15,000 families supported through crisis situations, and measurable improvements in community safety across dozens of neighborhoods. But Frank's presentation focused less on statistics than on stories, individual transformations that demonstrated the human impact of sustained intergenerational protection efforts. He told the story of Dorothy Martinez, who had become a community safety educator after being protected from robbery. He shared the journey of Robert Chen, who had become a financial fraud prevention advocate after escaping scammers. "These aren't just success stories," Frank explained to the national audience. "These are demonstration projects showing what becomes possible when communities choose to invest in protection rather than punishment, in relationship building rather than isolation." The national attention had led to requests for technical assistance from organizations in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Japan, countries where aging populations were facing similar challenges with crime, fraud, and social isolation affecting elderly residents. The Guardian's training manual had been translated into 8 languages and adapted for different cultural contexts, but the core principles remained consistent: authentic long-term commitment, integration of emergency response with community development, leadership development that created sustainability beyond individual personalities, and the understanding that protection required both professional skills and family-level relationships. Frank's role as an international consultant required extensive travel, but he maintained his hands-on involvement with local programs through video conferences and regular site visits. His continued connection to direct service delivery ensured that policy recommendations remained grounded in practical experience rather than theoretical approaches. The global network of Guardian-inspired programs now included chapters in 18 countries, creating an international community of veteran organizations committed to elder protection through service rather than institutional care through bureaucracy. If you've watched this far, say in the comments, what secret do you keep? The highway where Frank had been found bleeding and dying had been renamed the Guardian Angel Highway, in honor of the guardians who had saved his life and the protection network that had grown from that rescue. A memorial marker at the site told the story of how 18 veterans had stopped to help one elderly man and created a movement that transformed thousands of lives. The memorial included information about recognizing signs of roadside emergencies, contact information for emergency services, and educational materials about elder protection that were distributed to travelers who stopped to read Frank's story. The site had become a symbol of community responsibility and the importance of stopping to help people in need. The Texas Department of Transportation had incorporated Frank's story into their highway safety education programs, using his experience to teach drivers about the importance of investigating potential emergencies and reporting suspicious activities that might indicate criminal behavior. The mainstream media had eventually discovered Frank's story, but only after it had already inspired a movement that transformed how communities approached the intersection of aging populations, veteran service, and public safety. The coverage had helped spread their model to other regions and organizations, but media recognition was secondary to the practical reality of lives saved and communities strengthened. The Guardians proved that sometimes the most important miracles happen when good people stop to help someone who needs protection, observed television journalist Maria Rodriguez during a documentary about Frank's rescue. These veterans didn't just save one elderly man, they created a model for community protection that has prevented thousands of crimes and saved countless lives. National television networks, magazines, online platforms, and documentary filmmakers had featured stories about the Guardians that highlighted their unique approach to community protection and their success in combining veteran service with elder advocacy. The coverage had influenced policy discussions about aging, veteran reintegration, and community-based social services. But for Frank and the Guardians, their success was measured not in media coverage, but in the thousands of elderly residents who were living safely and independently because someone cared enough to protect them, the veterans who had found purpose through service, and the communities that had learned to value both vulnerability and strength. 10 years after being found dying beside Highway 287, Frank Martinez continued to serve as an elder advocate, while living a rich, protected life surrounded by the family that had chosen him and whom he had chosen in return. The Guardians had trained community protection teams in over 30 states, had contributed to the prevention of thousands of crimes against elderly victims, and had influenced fundamental changes in how law enforcement and social services approached elder protection. The organization that had begun with 18 veterans stopping to help one elderly man had grown into a national network of over 2,000 active members providing community protection services in 47 states. Their model had influenced federal legislation, state policies, and local programs throughout the United States and internationally. The criminals who had beaten Frank and left him for death were serving lengthy prison sentences, but the protection that had surrounded him that day lived on in every safety program they had created, every elderly resident they had helped, every veteran they had given purpose, and every community that had learned to value both the wisdom of age and the strength of those who serve others. If you're enjoying the story, write from which city you are listening to in the comments. The biker club that had stopped everything to save one dying man had created a legacy that continued to protect innocent lives throughout North America. Frank's story demonstrated that angels sometimes wear leather, ride motorcycles, and prove that the most important rescues often happen when people choose to investigate something that doesn't look right. His transformation from dying victim to community patriarch showed that healing was possible even from the worst experiences, and that family could be created through choice, service, and love, rather than just blood relations. The Guardians had proven that protecting innocent life required more than emergency response. It required the commitment to building communities where protection, dignity, and belonging were available to everyone who needed them. Frank's legacy lived on in every law enforcement officer who had learned to take elder abuse seriously, every criminal who had been prevented from targeting elderly victims, every trauma survivor who had found healing through protective relationships, and every community that had discovered the power of intergenerational cooperation based on mutual respect and shared commitment to serving others. The story of 18 bikers who found an elderly man dying beside a highway had become more than a rescue story. It had become a demonstration that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they chose to protect the innocent, that small acts of courage could lead to major victories for justice, and that sometimes the most important heroes are those who stop everything they're doing because someone helpless needs their protection. Frank's life proved that every innocent person deserves a chance for healing, that love could overcome any amount of previous harm, and that the bond between protectors and those they protect creates strength that extends far beyond individual relationships to transform entire communities and save countless future lives.